The Korean peninsula in late 1950 was a place where breath turned to ice before it left a man's mouth. The wind screamed down from the mountains of North Korea, carrying needles of snow that stung like shrapnel. The United Nations forces had been advancing for months, pushing the North Korean People's Army back past the 38th parallel, deeper and deeper toward the Yalu River. To the soldiers of the 1st Marine Division, it felt like the war was already won. But the hills around the Chosin Reservoir hid something no one expected: an army. In the early hours of November 1950, tens of thousands of Chinese soldiers began moving silently through the mountains, blending into the night and snow. Mao Zedong had sent them to drive the Americans out and to show the world that China would not tolerate a hostile army near its border. The Marines didn't know it yet, but they were marching straight into a trap that would become one of the most brutal tests of endurance in modern history. The 1st Marine Division, commanded by Major General Oliver P. Smith, was a force of roughly 30,000 men stretched thin along treacherous mountain roads. Their supply line ran from the port of Hungnam all the way up to the reservoir, a single lifeline winding through ridges and frozen valleys. Temperatures plunged below 30 degrees Celsius, 22 Fahrenheit. Engine oil froze, rifles jammed, and rations turned solid as rock. Yet morale remained steady. Marines were trained to fight in any condition. What they didn't realize was that they would soon be outnumbered 4-1. For many of them, it was their first winter war. They rubbed grease on their faces to fight frostbite, wrapped feet in spare socks, and learned to sleep beside running engines for warmth. The cold was an enemy all its own, one that didn't shoot, but killed just as surely. Frostbite cases began before the first shot was fired. Still, the men pressed north, unaware that thousands of Chinese volunteers from the 9th Army Group were descending upon them from the high ridges. On the evening of November 27, 1950, the quiet ended. The first signs were whispers carried on the wind, followed by flares arching across the night sky. Then came the bugles, haunting, metallic notes echoing off the frozen slopes. Moments later, automatic fire erupted from every direction. The hills themselves seemed alive with muzzle flashes. The Marines at Yudam-ni, Hagaru-ri, and Koto-ri found themselves surrounded. Chinese infantry charged in waves, wearing white camouflage and carrying burp guns, grenades, and even satchel charges. For the Americans, it was chaos, the kind that only comes when order collapses under surprise and cold. Machine gunners raked the slopes as mortars lit the sky. The snow turned grey with smoke and blood. The temperature dropped even lower, freezing the wounded where they fell. Radios crackled with broken pleas for reinforcements. The Chinese pressed closer, screaming war cries that echoed through the valley. Some Marines fought hand to hand, their bayonets glinting in the faint moonlight. Every ridge was contested. Every foot of ground was paid for with pain. Yet, even as ammunition dwindled and visibility vanished, discipline held. "Retreat, hell," one officer muttered. "We're just attacking in another direction." The battle for Yudam-ni became the anchor of the American line. Hundreds of small fights flared up simultaneously across the frozen mountains, each man's survival dependent on instinct, courage, and comradeship. The Chinese army attacked relentlessly, believing sheer numbers could crush the encircled Marines. But the Americans dug in, forming perimeter defenses with overlapping fields of fire. Mortar crews worked until their fingers split open. Medics crawled through snowdrifts to reach the wounded, using morphine that had frozen solid in its vials. Overhead, the night sky flickered with tracers and artillery bursts. When dawn finally broke, the landscape looked otherworldly. White hills scarred black by explosions, bodies half buried in snow, rifles frozen upright where their owners had fallen, Smoke drifted lazily across the basin of the Chosin Reservoir. The Marines had held their lines, but the cost was enormous. Hundreds were dead or missing, thousands wounded, and the enemy still closed in from every direction. General Smith radioed headquarters with grim calm. "We are not retreating. We are advancing in another direction." It wasn't bravado. It was survival. The 1st Marine Division would now have to fight its way out through 70 miles of mountain passes swarming with Chinese troops, in temperatures colder than anything most men had ever imagined. Ahead lay days of combat, exhaustion, and frostbite, a march through frozen hell. By dawn on November 28, 1950, the scale of the disaster became clear. The 1st Marine Division was surrounded. Along the frozen ridges of the Chosin Reservoir, every road, trail, and mountain pass was occupied by Chinese troops. Communication lines were severed, supply convoys ambushed, and air support hampered by blizzards. The Marines had entered a battlefield with no front line, only chaos frozen in time. The snow was waist-deep, and the wind carried the cries of the wounded for miles. Engines refused to start in the cold. Soldiers used blowtorches to heat machine guns and mortars. Every breath came out as a cloud of ice. Frostbite became as deadly as bullets. Fingers blackened, faces turned white with numbness, and blood froze to the steel of rifles. At Yudam-ni, General Oliver P. Smith gathered his officers. His words were calm, deliberate, spoken by a man who refused to panic. "We're not retreating," he said. "We're attacking in another direction." It wasn't a slogan. It was an order for survival. The Marines would break out to the south, toward Hagaru-ri, where an airstrip could be built for evacuation and resupply. But between them and safety lay 70 miles of frozen mountains crawling with enemy soldiers. The night assaults never stopped. The Chinese 9th Army Group, numbering nearly 120,000 men, attacked in waves, bugles blaring, grenades flashing, and voices shouting through the dark. They fought with fierce discipline, using human wave tactics to overwhelm positions. Many carried only rifles, some had no winter uniforms, and thousands froze to death before even reaching the American lines. Yet they kept coming, determined to annihilate the Marines. Each hilltop became its own war. Companies fought in isolation, holding out for hours or days with dwindling ammunition. Corpsmen crawled through snow to drag back the wounded, their own hands too frozen to untie bandages. Blood froze instantly, forming a crimson glaze on the snow. For the Americans, movement was life. They couldn't stay still. Stillness meant death. Patrols scouted ahead, often vanishing into the blinding white haze. Supply planes risked everything to airdrop food and ammunition, their parachutes blooming like strange flowers against the grey sky. Many drops missed their targets and disappeared into the mountains, swallowed by the snow. At Toktong Pass, a narrow stretch of road linking Yudam-ni and Hagaru-ri, a small detachment of Marines under Lieutenant Colonel Raymond Davis held firm against repeated assaults. The pass was the lifeline. If it fell, the entire division would be cut off and destroyed. For 5 days, Davis's men fought in conditions so brutal that rifles cracked from the cold. When night fell, temperatures plunged below 35 degrees. Men slept beside burning fuel cans, their faces covered with ice from their own breath. Frostbite gnawed through boots and gloves, claiming fingers and toes. Rations were frozen solid. The only way to eat was to thaw food with body heat. Yet morale somehow endured. Each Marine knew that if he gave up, the man next to him might die. The Chinese, too, suffered horribly. Many wore only cotton uniforms. Frostbite and starvation tore through their ranks. Entire platoons froze to death in foxholes, still gripping their rifles. But their commanders kept pushing them forward. Every hill became a graveyard, and the snow buried them all the same, enemy and ally alike. By December 1st, the breakout began. The Marines at Yudam-ni formed a massive convoy, trucks, tanks, ambulances, and hundreds of walking wounded. They called it the Frozen Division. Moving south meant fighting for every yard. The Chinese blocked the road with barricades of logs and bodies. Snipers picked off drivers through cracked windshields. Each bend in the mountain road became a kill zone. The columns advanced in grim silence, guided by the faint glow of flares. Engineers cleared mines, medics treated wounds in the open snow, and officers marked targets for airstrikes with smoke grenades. Marine corsairs roared overhead, diving low to strafe enemy positions. Their presence was the only warmth in a frozen world. Every mile felt like a year. Tanks pulled trucks through snowdrifts, while Marines marched alongside, rifles slung low, eyes hollow from exhaustion. Many were frostbitten, starving, and numb with fatigue, but none abandoned their comrades. The wounded refused evacuation until others were safe. By the time they reached the outskirts of Hagaru-ri, the division had been fighting non-stop for 6 days. The airstrip there was barely operational. Engineers worked day and night under fire to make it usable. C-47 transport planes landed on ice-slick runways, evacuating the worst wounded and dropping supplies. Hagaru-ri became a sanctuary in hell, but it wouldn't last long. The Chinese launched one final massive assault on the night of December 6th. Waves of soldiers surged out of the darkness, their silhouettes illuminated by flares. Marines held the perimeter with machine guns and mortars, the roar of battle echoing across the frozen valley. When dawn came, the snow was red again. The Chinese dead lay in heaps, their white uniforms blending into the ice. The Marines had held, but the way south was still choked with enemies. The order was clear: move to Koto-ri. The breakout had to continue. The Chosin campaign was not yet over. The worst was still ahead. The breakout from Hagaru-ri began under a grey, frozen dawn. Columns of exhausted men and vehicles crept down the narrow road toward Koto-ri, a small town 70 miles from the sea. The convoy looked less like an army and more like survivors of some ancient disaster. Trucks rattled along the icy road, engines coughing in the cold. Tanks with frozen treads pulled trailers loaded with the wounded. Marines trudged beside them, their boots stiff with ice, faces hidden behind scarves blackened with soot and frostbite. The air smelled of diesel, cordite, and death. For every mile they advanced, the Chinese struck from the hills. Snipers hid among rocks, mortars screamed from unseen ridges, and the sound of bugles rose whenever the columns slowed. The Marines moved like ghosts, silent except for the crunch of snow underfoot. Every step south was fought with blood. The wounded refused to cry out. Sound carried too easily in the still, frozen air. They learned that even a whisper could bring a storm of bullets. The Chinese attacks came in waves, hundreds charging from the fog, yelling war cries that echoed like thunder in the valleys. The Marines fired until their weapons jammed, cleared them, and fired again. Bodies littered the road, frozen in strange positions, faces twisted in mid-shout. The cold preserved everything. Even the fallen seemed to be watching the living march past. When night fell, the temperature dropped below 37 degrees. The stars were sharp as glass in the clear sky, and the moonlight turned the battlefield silver. Men huddled in foxholes dug into permafrost, sharing rations of frozen chocolate bars and canned beans they thawed over burning fuel. Some fell asleep and never woke up, killed not by bullets, but by the cold itself. Officers moved among their troops, whispering encouragement. Corpsmen carried morphine syringes in their mouths to keep them from freezing. They treated frostbite, shrapnel wounds, and trench foot under the dim light of flickering lanterns. The smell of blood and kerosene filled the night. Above them, aircraft droned, Marine corsairs and Air Force transports circling like guardian angels, dropping supplies by parachute. The next morning, the march continued. At times, they were forced to stop and clear roadblocks of corpses and wreckage. Tanks led the way, crushing obstacles beneath their treads. Behind them, engineers worked with dynamite and bulldozers to keep the route open. Every explosion sent avalanches cascading down the slopes. The mountains groaned under the weight of war. At Funchilin Pass, the road narrowed into a winding ledge carved into a cliffside. Below lay a gorge so deep that even sound seemed to vanish into it. The Chinese had blown up the only bridge across it, a span of steel beams dangling uselessly above the void. For a moment, the entire escape seemed doomed, but the Marines refused to stop. Engineers radioed for help, and within hours, Air Force cargo planes dropped sections of a new bridge by parachute. In the freezing darkness, under fire, the Marines rebuilt it piece by piece. By morning, the convoy was moving again, an act of sheer defiance against both man and nature. The wounded were loaded onto trucks. Some had to be stacked like cordwood, motionless and silent beneath tarps. Each bump in the road drew muffled groans. Medics kept count, marking the dead quietly with chalk. Yet the living pressed on. They had one purpose: reach Koto-ri, then fight their way down to Hungnam, where ships waited to take them home. Every few miles, small groups of Marines covered the retreat, fighting rearguard actions to hold off the Chinese. Some never came back. Their sacrifice bought the rest of the column precious time. The road south was lined with wrecked vehicles and burnt-out tanks. Snow covered everything in a silent shroud. In the distance, the mountains glowed red where artillery shells burst against the rock. By the time the lead elements reached Koto-ri, they had been marching and fighting for 10 straight days. Food was gone, ammunition low, and frostbite cases had doubled. Yet when they saw the smoke from the town, hope flickered again. They had made it through the worst. Behind them lay a trail of destruction. Ahead waited one last descent to the coast. At Koto-ri, they rested for less than 24 hours. The town was no more than a cluster of huts surrounded by ice-coated hills. Supply planes dropped fuel and ammunition, and Navy aircraft hammered enemy positions to the south. The men cleaned weapons, thawed their boots near fires, and wrote letters home on scraps of ration boxes. They didn't write about fear. They wrote about brotherhood, pride, and the strange beauty of snow falling after battle. But there was no time to dwell. Orders came down from General Smith. Continue the movement to Hungnam. The road would take them through narrow valleys, across more frozen rivers, and into ambush after ambush. The Marines knew the pattern by now. March, fight, freeze, move. The nightmare was routine. By December 9th, the last great engagement near Koto-ri ended in another bloody stand. Chinese forces attacked from both flanks, desperate to cut off the retreating column. The Marines responded with everything they had left: machine guns, tanks, artillery, and airstrikes so close that pilots could see the men on the ground. When the smoke cleared, the snowfield was littered with bodies, and the survivors moved on, step by step, toward the sea. The long road south was nearly done, but the cost was etched into every face. Eyes hollow, hands trembling, they trudged through the final miles as living ghosts of war. They had fought through encirclement, starvation, and a winter that seemed determined to erase them from the earth. Yet they were still moving, frozen souls refusing to die. the mountains finally opened into a frozen plain leading toward the port city of Hungnam. After 2 weeks of unbroken combat and retreat, the men of the 1st Marine Division could smell the sea again. The bitter wind carried the scent of salt and smoke. For many, that smell meant life. But between them and salvation still stood thousands of Chinese soldiers determined to annihilate them before they reached the coast. Columns of exhausted Marines, soldiers, and South Korean refugees stretched for miles. Trucks groaned under the weight of supplies and wounded men. Tank crews scanned the ridgelines, expecting an ambush at every turn. The convoy looked like a procession of ghosts, weary, frostbitten figures trudging through snow that had turned pink with old blood. Aircraft from the US Navy's Task Force 77 roared overhead, pounding enemy positions that threatened the road. Each explosion shook the ground, but gave the men hope. Someone still watched over them. The Chinese struck again near the village of Hungnam, attacking under cover of snow squalls. The Marines formed a perimeter and fought back with everything left. Rifles frozen stiff, mortars cracking in the cold. The snow turned black with soot and shrapnel. When the fighting ended, the field was silent except for the moaning wind. The road to Hungnam was finally open. They entered the outskirts of the port on December 11th, 1950. The city had become a fortress, ringed with artillery, filled with refugees, and echoing with the hum of naval engines offshore. The Marines, Army units, and British commandos coordinated a massive defensive line, while evacuation ships gathered in the harbour. There were more than 100,000 civilians waiting to be rescued alongside the soldiers. The scale was staggering. And yet, in that frozen chaos, discipline held. For days, the perimeter around Hungnam became the stage for one final stand. Chinese divisions pressed in from the hills, shelling the port, probing for weakness. The Marines held firm, fighting from trenches carved into ice. Navy destroyers fired from offshore, their shells whistling overhead to smash enemy concentrations. Each night the horizon glowed red with fire and tracer rounds. The men joked grimly that even hell itself couldn't be colder than Hungnam. Within the city, scenes of heartbreak played out hour by hour. Families huddled near the docks, clutching bundles of belongings. Soldiers shared rations with children whose faces were raw from windburn. Refugees boarded landing craft under the cover of artillery smoke, while military bands played faint, defiant tunes through loudspeakers. Despite exhaustion, the Marines helped organize the evacuation, guiding civilians onto ships with frozen hands and quiet dignity. "No one gets left behind" became their creed, not just for soldiers, but for every soul who had survived that march. As the last units prepared to withdraw, engineers wired explosives around the port to destroy everything that could be used by the enemy. Fuel depots, ammunition, rail lines, even the pier itself. The operation was called the Christmas Miracle at Hungnam. Over 100,000 troops and civilians would be evacuated in what became one of the most remarkable rescues in military history. On December 24, 1950, the final elements of the 1st Marine Division boarded the transport ships. The sky was pale blue, the sea calm, as if the world had finally exhaled. As the last Marines climbed aboard, demolition charges began to roar across the harbour. Explosions rolled through Hungnam, buildings collapsing, storage tanks erupting in pillars of flame. The ground trembled as the pier itself disintegrated behind them. One Marine turned to watch the city vanish in fire and whispered, "That's for the ones we couldn't bring home." From the decks of the ships, they looked back at the Korean coastline fading into the smoke. They had entered the mountains as an army and emerged as legends. They had fought their way through encirclement, hunger, and temperatures colder than steel. and they had not broken. The world called it a retreat, but for those who lived it, it was a victory of the human spirit. In the aftermath, historians would marvel at the numbers. Roughly 17,000 American casualties, tens of thousands of Chinese dead or frozen in the snow. The Marines had destroyed much of the enemy's strength while saving their division from total annihilation. It was a triumph born of endurance rather than conquest. The frozen hills of Chosin would forever echo with their footsteps. Years later, veterans of that battle would gather under warmer skies. They would speak softly of friends who never made it down from the reservoir, of the endless nights and the road lined with ice. And they would repeat the words that became their unofficial motto. We are not retreating. We are just advancing in another direction. Because in truth, they had never retreated. They had walked through hell and carried each other out. The Battle of Chosin Reservoir became a symbol of courage under impossible conditions. It defined the Marine Corps ethos for generations. No Marine left behind. In Korea's mountains, surrounded and outnumbered, ordinary men performed extraordinary deeds. Their march to the sea was not just survival. It was proof that willpower could outlast even nature itself. Every winter since, as snow falls on the Korean hills, locals say the land still remembers. Beneath the ice and silence lie the ghosts of two nations who met in frozen fury. But among them, the Marines of Chosin still stand. Frozen souls, unbroken, forever walking toward home.